Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special webinar. Uh, Let me introduce first. Hi, I'm Tejas. I look after the outbound marketing strategy at Hurix Digital. And today we're going to have a very important discussion on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the role it plays in the K-12 domain, content, as well as the education industry. Welcome to the webinar brought to you by Hurix Digital. Topic is the impact of diversity, equity, and inclusion on K-12 education. So now, diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI as it's called in educational content, has become now an expectation of the education domain. DEI should be seen as mission critical at K-12 schools. Why? Because a diverse faculty and student body, along with an environment that promotes equity and inclusion of all the voices, is actually the heart of education. So, since positive impressions are formed very early in young minds, examining and fine tuning K-12 education programs is a great first step. And that's why we're having this webinar today with our panel of experts who are going to decode the concept of diversity, equity, and inclusion for K-12 schools, administrators, publishers, through their course design that are going to look to address these inequities. So to reveal the true nature of DEI and its impact on K-12 education, we have two amazing panelists today joining us from the US. Firstly, our guest expert is Kristy Lilas. She is the VP of Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging at GoDaddy. She has a lot of prior experience in educational publishing field as well. And secondly, we have our in-house expert, Tracy Cugini, who is the editorial director of education at Hurix Digital. So welcome to the webinar, Kristy and Tracy. Fantastic to have you here.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Great. So what we have here is a presentation, which you can see now on the screen, where we are going to navigate the different topics we want to talk about today and get these insights on DEI from our panelists. So we are just going to go through this presentation deck, have a conversation with our panelists. It's going to be pretty much conversational and pick their thoughts along the way as we go through the slides. We have some time at the end of the PPT to get your questions answered. We have around 20 minutes for that. And but you can still ask your questions during the webinar as well, as and when you feel relevant. And if it's relevant to the flow of the conversation as well, I can ask the panelists for their opinions on the same. So keep your questions coming in. So let us start with the presentation here. Firstly, what is diversity, equity, and inclusion? And for that, I'll go to Kristy for this one. Can you decode this for our audience today in plain language?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And I think it's always really important to start with definitions so that we all know what we're actually talking about here, right? Especially considering some of these topics can be a bit complex or they can be defined differently depending on context. So for the focus of the conversation today, I'd like to invite you all to a dinner party, because I think an easy way to think about DEI is to imagine yourself being invited to a dinner, which is something I think most of us have experienced at some point in our lives, right? So diversity at that dinner party is having a lot of different people reflecting different experiences, perspectives, and identities gathered around the table. Equity is how each of our seats are made specifically to allow all of us to eat comfortably at that table. And for example, one seat might be taller than another, because what you can't see on Zoom today is that I'm actually on the shorter side. So my seat might have to be a little bit higher so that I can sit at an equal height as others. One seat might not have arms. One space might be actually open for a wheelchair, etc. And inclusion is not only having a seat at that table, but also having a voice and feeling like you're being heard and listened to while speaking, right? And then I don't want to forget, we don't have the B on the acronym at the top of the slide here, but I don't want to forget the sense of belonging, which is to say that, it's really having all of these other components of DEI, but then on top of that, feeling truly valued for your presence and contributions at that table. So you weren't just invited, you weren't just sat equitably at that table, you weren't just heard at that table, but the folks around you made it feel like, you were really wanted at that dinner, and that your contributions there in particular were really valued.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point that you're bringing up, that it's not just about bringing people to the table. It's not just about including all the voices. It's about really showing individuals that they are included in that, and that their opinion is not only going to be heard, but valued, understood. And you can't always understand everyone's opinion or their point of view, but I think that part of the initiatives is just to make that effort, put yourself in a position where you can try to understand, try to use that empathy. I think that's really where you need to be coming from in a DEI initiative.
Right. And I think, Tracy, to that point, it's important to think about all of these at the same time as well. Because I think we often get caught up in focusing on diversity or focusing on inclusion, but without having them all to be complementary pieces, then we're never going to really have the impact or the outcomes that we're looking for when it comes to enabling folks in their success.
All right. Just a question over there to Kristy. We know about diversity, equity, and inclusion, but how does inclusion really differ from belonging over here? Can you explain a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So I think another example I'll use is, imagine yourself meeting people for the first time, right? Let's say you're coming into that dinner party and you haven't met a lot of the folks who are there. And, for those of us who work in a corporate setting, this is an experience we have often. We're going up to introduce ourselves to a new group, and they turn to us as we introduce ourselves and they say hello. So then they've opened up the group so that we can walk in and actually have they all acknowledge our presence, right? And they've included us in that space. But then they turn away and ignore us for the rest of the time that you're standing there, right? Or they say hello and they turn around and
continue the conversation,
right? Exactly, right.
On a topic that you have no way to contribute to.
Exactly. So while you are physically or in some way being included in that group, because they accept that your presence is there, right? They've acknowledged you. I don't know if I would call that a sense of belonging, if I'm not actually feeling like anyone is trying to proactively engage with me, or that my presence is at all valued, right? So I think that's
and then you run, sorry to talk over you, you run the risk then of, was I invited here as a token? Was I an afterthought in this? Was I meant to be in this conversation?
Right.
So that's something to think about.
Okay, fantastic. Got it. Going to the next slide now. How does the concept of diversity, inclusion, and belonging actually impact the students? I remember, Kristy, when we were discussing about this topic, you had a little playground theory for it. So can you explain that to us? How is it going to impact K-12 students in particular?
Sure. And I think sometimes we get a little caught up in thinking about the why to this work. So I really want to try to simplify it. Let's get that down to basics around why this work is so important. So back to that dinner party scenario, we'll change it up and we'll play the playground scenario, right? And I just have some reflective questions for you that I think will allow us to think about the impact. Now, do you think a student is going to be set up for success if they're part of a group where they feel like they are the only one who is different in a sea of other kids who are similar to each other, right? Do we really feel like that's really setting that student up for success if they can't see themselves reflected anywhere in the world around them? What if the teachers and administrators also don't look or sound anything like them, right? What if a student is desperately trying to keep up with classmates who've had access to good tutors, good quality food, parents who help them with their homework, who have time to engage with them, but they've had none of that, right? How about if, back to that conversation on belonging, the student feels constantly excluded from their classmates, who turn away when they try to engage and who don't invite them to participate? My question really around, when we talk about why is DEI important for students is, would any of you feel like you were set up for success, or that you belonged in that situation? Would any of that feel distracting to you, Tracy?
Absolutely.
Would you be able to concentrate if that was your experience?
Not. And it's so easy to shut down when you're confronted with a situation where you feel like you don't belong, you feel like you can't relate to the people that you're seeing, the examples that you're seeing in your classroom, all the imagery, or someone who doesn't look like me or doesn't sound like me, or I just can't relate to that person in a way, and it's so easy to shut down and say, well, I have to be here, I have to be at school, but it's not, this isn't really for me, or
Right.
This is for all these other people and I'm just here because I have to be, or something. It's really, it's hard to continually show up and engage with something that doesn't seem like it's meant for you.
Right.
That you're like an outsider to this group,
Right, exactly. And that's why I say that, I think DEI is not the what, it's actually the how. The what is opportunity, survival, comfort, and success. DEI is just a tool and a resource and a framework that we apply to think about how we can enable those things for our students. And I think it's really important to think about the special context here of K through 12 education. Oh, sorry, Tejas, were you?
Yeah.
Did you have something you wanted to ask?
No, I mean, in terms of, DEI is obviously going to be taught in higher ed educational content as well as K-12. So particularly for K-12, why is it so important that, all these values of, DEI and belonging are provided to the students from a very young age?
Right. I was about to go there.
So yeah, I was just because you really can't start in higher ed. It's too late by then. If someone has gone all the way through school not really feeling invited to that table, it's too easy, like I said, to shut down early. And so you can't wait until college admissions time to start thinking about DEI. I think if students are given the chance to see people like them, see content that's relevant to them all the way through their education, they stay engaged longer. They're more likely to go through the process set up for success. They're more likely to engage through their entire education. And you can't wait until they're older, because they've already kind of decided that's just not for me now. That I don't see examples of people like myself succeeding in these roles. I don't see that any of this is intended for me. I don't know how to talk. And, the more that you're kind of shut out of the conversation, the quieter you get throughout your time.
Right. Well, and then think about, to that point, right, the timing of this sort of experience and how foundational that is for our broader society, right? So in K through 12, we're literally setting the tone for the next generation. And there's such power in learning. And what we are taught and what we experience as students really creates that foundational understanding of both the world around us and each other. So if there's any time that we should prioritize, and that I think we really must prioritize DEI to have the biggest impact, it should be during K through 12. But you don't have to just take my word for it anymore either. There's all kinds of research pointing to this too, Tracy. So we could go into that, but there's a whole lot of research.
I love hearing about the research. Anecdotally, I am the mother of a kindergartner, and at that age, they're just so open to ideas. They are so they accept things very easily. I don't think that they get boxed into labels and barriers at that age. So they're really open to seeing other people, and I want that to continue. As someone who is raising a small white male, it really makes me want him to get that diversity, not just in his classmates, but in the education that he's getting. I want him to see stories from people who are not like him, because it's a little bit too easy, I think, for him to see many, many, many examples like him. And I want him to value the voices of other people. And you can't do that if you're never seeing them in your education, if you're never seeing them in your storybooks, when you're opening your workbook for, kindergarten math, and you never see any character that doesn't look exactly like you. I think it's hard to reach that place, and you just take it for granted that everyone is like you.
Right. And you're never hearing from them and seeing their day-to-day life experience as well. And one of the reasons why I got into education for my career was because I saw the the true power of learning, not just from what's on a page and in the books that we're reading, right, but also from learning from each other and each other's life experiences.
Yeah.
Without having access to that, how could we ever empathize with other folks' experiences throughout the world?
Oh, absolutely. So,
I
Kristy,
just
what
think
are
that,
some of
I
the
mean,
research? Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
it just adds to the point that, educating K-12 students on DEI makes them more sensitized to the environment and leads to an overall, well-rounded up individuals growing up. That's the main point here. Go ahead, Tracy. This is-
Well, I was going to ask Kristy about some of the research that she's encountered as part of her work, but I wanted to add one more point that I think you have a unique opportunity in K through 12 to make DEI so organic to the way they learn. Not that, oh, we're going to have a unit on diversity, but just constantly including diverse images of people, diverse characters. Education at this stage is often scenario based, where you have examples, you often have characters and books and stories. And I think if there's just such a unique opportunity to represent a lot of different characters at that time, rather than saying, let's learn about diversity now. They just sort of organically receive this and they understand there's lots of people coming to the table.
Right. That's a really important point that we'll talk a little bit more about later when we think about best practices, because DEI does not work when it's treated as this thing over here. Right. It really truly needs to be integrated organically into the day-to-day. So to your point, Tracy, we don't know that we're talking about DEI concepts. We just know that we're talking about people and we're talking about life experience and we're talking about the world around us, because that is all that DEI really is. It's just being thoughtful and deliberate about those considerations and integrating it into the day-to-day and how we engage with each other and how we learn and how we do our jobs is going to be the best way to have an impact.
Absolutely.
Definitely. Yeah.
I think Tracy.
Some of the.
Oh, go ahead, Kristy.
I just wanted to answer your question because I think you were about to ask about the research that I've seen in this space, which gets back to some of Tejas' point before around the impact in K through 12. So just a couple of examples, and again, don't take my word for it. Simple Google searches will give you all kinds of great data and research, and I think that's the beauty of where we are today, is that we now have this, this research to allow us to build our business cases and to really talk about the why. But it was one study in particular that I love that really talked about, they actually followed students into their adulthood and tried to see how concepts like DEI impacted how they experienced adulthood as they learned about it in childhood. And they saw that the benefits enabled personal growth, purpose, a feeling of purpose in life, and more community engagement well into adulthood. So as those students engaged with DEI, it allowed them to experience those impacts as they got older. Another study found that a feeling of belonging, and this one's pretty obvious, right, but leads to higher student retention. Imagine that. When you feel like you belong somewhere, you'll stay. Other studies have shown and have proven out the impact of DEI on things like engagement and critical thinking skills and creativity and individual health and well-being. And when I look at things like this, I mean, again, it all feels a little bit obvious, right? But when we actually have the data and the research to back it up, it just kind of quantifies the impact that I think we all know is part of what the point of DEI is. And it really, I think, points to why it should be one of our highest priorities in K through 12 to enable student success.
Yeah, I love the idea of a study that really follows them into adulthood, because I think sometimes when you're looking at research, it's such a small subset or such a small time frame that you're seeing these students. So I love studies that follow children all the way through, because it's like, okay, what, one, just the care that it takes to do a study like that. And I don't know how many students were involved in that, but I just love reading about that, because you get to see the whole breadth of what that really means. The dedication to put that research into place and to stay with it for the whole time, I think is really important to see those long-term effects. I think that's great. Also, I always kind of think about career choices. We love to ask kids, what do you want to be when you grow up? That's a question I remember being asked as a kid. I find myself asking that to kids all the time. And I think if that's something that's I think is really affected by DEI, because I think if you're a child and you never see examples of people like you going into different careers, as a girl, like during my childhood, there was never a woman president, for instance, and things like that. I think it's important to see examples of, well, what kind of jobs could I do? And, as a child, you're kind of told, oh, you can be anything. But if you don't really see examples of that, I think it's hard to really believe that. So I like the idea of this following them into adulthood, this research to see, did access to DEI education, did it impact who they became or what they engaged with as they got older, choices that they made and opportunities that they saw for themselves.
And I can personally say that it absolutely impacted where I am today, for two reasons, right? One is I came from a family of folks who never had corporate or business jobs. So I had no idea what that experience or life or what, like, the pay would be like, what my skill sets had to be to get into that world. I didn't know how to interview for jobs like that, right? And in my school, there wasn't a whole lot of career development or coaching support around that, right? I think they all assumed that you would get that at home, you would get that from your parents, but what happens when your parents don't have that experience to share with you?
Right. And none of the people none of your family, none of your neighbors. Yeah.
Exactly, right. I had to figure it all out as I went. And then secondly, I have a distinct memory of a time when I was talking to a guidance counselor. And then this carried over into my higher education as well, where I was a good student. I was a very good student because I love learning, as you can tell from all the things that I've been sharing with you. And I also had to work essentially almost a full-time job as I was in school. So while I did really, really well, I just kind of, I had a slightly better grade in certain subjects like English and some of the softer kind of subjects. And I remember actually being very specifically pushed in that direction and steered away from things like math and science, even though I loved math and science. And today, if you ask me what I want to be when I say an astronomer, but if I could redo it, I might go and work at NASA, right? But it was interesting because then I look back at my report cards when I became an adult and I realized I was just as good at math and science as I was at English and reading and literature. But why was I being pushed into that direction? Was it because of my perceived gender? Was it because, where folks thought that I had the kind of background or support? And I think it really, really clearly changed the trajectory of my career just because of those like small comments here and there, or the small pushes here and there where folks felt like they were doing me a favor, but it might have been influenced a bit by their unconscious biases at the time.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I was just speaking with someone who was expressing concern that their middle schools were being asked to form these specialized tracks so that sort of in the way that sometimes high schools have specialized tracks for STEM education or liberal arts education, that this was starting to happen in middle school in their town. And that's really concerning because you're really just finding yourself at that time. You're still so young, all through K through 12, really. So to start being pushed onto a specialized track that, like you said, maybe you express some interest in that at some point, but that doesn't mean you don't want to have specialized STEM education as well. Or, it's a little concerning because if you don't get that full breadth of experience, and are you being pushed onto a certain track because of something someone perceives about you? That's worrisome. So it's interesting that you say that affected what what career path you took later.
Right. And we'll talk more about some of those best practices to prevent that sort of unconscious bias from creeping in, but certainly a real life example.
So Tracy, I mean, Kristy just talked about her experiences of DI-based content, but what are the types of DI-based content examples that can help educators, administrators, and publishers? Anything that you have come across in your experience which make the curriculum more diverse and equitable? Anything that you can recount?
Yeah, absolutely. I know that there has been a push in I work largely with higher education content in my job, and there's certainly a push at that level to make sure that publishers are definitely taking the opportunity to revisit their current content and their legacy content to see what kind of inclusion that they have. Is there bias in the content that they already have? And I think that that's particularly critical in K through 12. And I know that there has been there's always a lot of scrutiny on what's being taught in K through 12, what kind of books are being taught, what's part of the curricula, and not just for the hard subjects, but what stories are being represented, what books are not being represented, and what books are not allowed to be taught in schools anymore. I think that that's a big push. And so I think one thing schools and certain parents are doing is really trying to look at what kind of examples of what is considered the top literature that each kid is going to read. There are certain books that every kid will end up reading as part of their schooling, as part of their education. That particularly in the later grades where kids can read more independently and they start reading novels or what have you. So I think that one thing that parents and individuals and certainly educators and administrators can do is taking a look at that. And just because it's considered a classic, do we have to keep teaching it? Does it represent something that, is this particular story a good one? Or is there something else we can substitute that would get some of the same principles to our, students, but maybe include the story of a diverse person, someone who they aren't constantly hearing about? Do we need to constantly hear about Huck Finn, or could we get a story that has somebody else represented? Could it be a story from a woman? Could it be from a story from an indigenous person that they've never considered their perspective? I think that that's really important. And one thing that's easy to do is just what is being taught. Could I substitute one book for another? And I don't mean textbooks, because of course there is a lot of consideration when you're adopting textbooks, and that's huge committees of people who have to approve that. But if you're going to assign a short story in a classroom, for instance, could I look for something that is a little bit more diverse than what I included last year? If I'm going to put together some pictures around the classroom, could I include some other people that I haven't included before? And it's not, again, to just make a token of that particular image or that particular person, but could I find an important story to tell from a different perspective that these students haven't gotten last year, didn't get the year before, and is there something I could teach that's new? Certainly I think that's one place to start.
Oh, and Tejas, I think maybe now's a good time to get to the next slide where we can talk about some of those best practices that Tracy just mentioned across the entire life cycle, right? Because we're getting into the details, which is this is where the fun stuff is. This is where the actual change and impact can be made.
Absolutely.
And I can't I can't help but put my strategy and operations hat on, which is some of the work that I've done in the ed tech industry. When I want to just point out that we were just talking about a couple of very tactical examples as a part of this overall life cycle, but one thing that I think we really all need to think about as we again prioritize how we integrate DEI truly into what we do is to take that step back and actually look at the broad K through 12 student life cycle end to end, and then start asking ourselves questions about, okay, where do I specifically sit in this? Where's my role? Or what does my company do? Or what does my organization do? Or what does my school own as part of this life cycle? And then what do I individually own as part of that through my role, right? And just taking a look at that broader view and starting to think about some of the questions, exact questions that Tracy was just asking, right? Who are we representing? Where? How? Why? Who are we involving? Where? How? Why? Right? What are we thinking about in terms of tools and resources? How are we prioritizing the concept of equity, which is really, thinking about how we're bringing everyone to the same starting point or up to the same kind of standard throughout this process. So it sounds like a lot, but it's actually quite simple, because I think just starting with questions across this life cycle, and we could talk about some specific questions as administrators, educators, and publishers, but just starting with questions really starts to unlock the potential opportunities that we can consider. And then also the questions that lead to questions that we want to answer that we can't answer, because none of us could understand all of the complexity of human experience, right? And all the different kinds of biases that we all face. So how are we involving the folks who we want to prioritize, the success of in the solutions for them specifically?
Yeah, do you want to start taking us through?
Yeah, take us through the process on how to prioritize DEI K-12 for any organization watching right now.
All right, sounds good. I'll start, but of course, Tracy and Tejas, please jump in with thoughts as I go. So we can start thinking about how we really should prioritize both the personal and the structural. And when I say that, I mean specifically, how are we bringing people along and supporting individuals, but also how are we looking at the systems and the processes that enable those individuals and ensure that those are equitable. And I say that because one without the other doesn't have the right impact, right? We can change hearts and minds all day long, but if the systems that those people are actually running are inequitable, then there's only so much we can do. And conversely, we can update systems and processes to be equitable, but if the people running those systems and processes are doing so from a place of bias, then clearly that impact will be mitigated as well. So thinking through the lens of both of those things, we can start with educators and administrators, right? So during assessing and the processes and policies used for prospecting and placement. So how are we actually sourcing students for the schools and the different institutions that we have? Through that, have we considered whether marginalized or underprivileged kids are being disproportionately affected by those policies in any way? Do we have an answer to that? And if not, how might we that answer, right? Do we have data? Do we have research? Do we have conversations that we need to pursue to ensure that there's no disproportional impact that's unintended? And throughout that process, how specifically are we thinking about equity, which might involve more deliberate support for certain groups from underprivileged backgrounds, right? One example of an attempt at equity and equitable processes are these concepts of universal enrollment systems, which is, essentially software-driven ways to place kids to prevent segregation. But of course, as we've realized that the technologies we're using are a bit flawed, so it actually may be causing more segregation in certain areas, right? So how are we governing the systems and the processes that we do put in place as well to ensure that the impact is as expected and intended? And I will say there are lots of local and national organizations who can help with something like an equity review of policies and systems and approaches that are often really research-driven and data-backed, so that you can feel confident that you're really thinking about these things from an equitable perspective.
Yeah, I think that's really important because, like you said, I think that there have been attempts to do that. And sometimes the methodology is flawed. Sometimes the interventions have not been as helpful. So I think it's an important thing to keep revisiting. You can't make one attempt at this and say, oh, we fixed that problem, super diverse everywhere, because that's not always the case. So it's something that constantly has to be revisited. And I think that's important.
Right. It's never one and done. And there's always opportunity and possibility to make iterative improvement, considering the complexity of these conversations and these topics.
And not just the students, the staff as well. I think, when you are hiring, administrators are hiring educators, how much attention are they paying to that sort of thing? Like, what is the process for recruiting people who are unlike your other staff, from different backgrounds, from different perspectives, that needs to be considered as well.
Right. And you see at the bottom there's that mention of policies, programs, training and operations, right? That's just say that the way that we're running the organization is just as important as the way that we're focused on students. To your point, Tracy, if we don't have equitable hiring practices, if we don't have, training around things like DEI for the folks who are sitting across this life cycle, then again, our impact will be stunted in really significant ways.
Yeah.
So to that point, Kristy, do you think that every one of these processes there needs to be a DEI champion working behind it, whether it be hiring, whether it be the post enrollment, or even after the person graduates, getting them some opportunities in the job market, trying to support them in those processes? Well, do you think there needs to be a DEI champion for all of these processes?
It's a good question that doesn't necessarily have a specific answer, only because I think every organization or every school or administration is going to be at a different point and have different structures in place or ways that they'd like to approach the work. And I really encourage everyone to find the way that works for them. There are a couple traps though that I'd like you to look out for as you think about that, which is to say the end goal is that everybody has clear ownership over DEI, and that no singular person is responsible for it, right? So as the head of DEIB at my work, when I come in is, I don't own this work. I do not own this work. We all own this work together. Mm-hmm. I'm here to help with the strategy, the planning, the execution, the governance, right? But how are we going to integrate this into the way that you all do your jobs? And then as we roll out things, it gets pushed to the team that owns it. So like a DEI champion across these different aspects of the life cycle could be a helpful way to get started. But we want to make sure that we don't fall into the trap that everybody only sees them as the person who has to worry about it. They're the only person who has to, actually drive anything around it, and instead focus on that integration.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point because, when you think about having one person, it's easy to think, oh, okay, we're going to get a DEI person on our staff, but that's not always plausible. That's money, that's budget, that can't always happen. So how do we make a lot of different people that DEI champion, within the department, within the classroom? It's like you said, it's not one person should own this process, though it is helpful to have one person who can get started and help people. But that's not always going to be possible. So what are the ways that can be, put throughout? How can people be shown that they can own that process themselves?
Right. Well, and I think what we're doing here actually is a good start to that conversation, is to get the folks who own the different pieces of this life cycle in a room and start asking questions. Okay, so if we keep moving on, right, during application and assessment, during that phase, how are we working to mitigate how bias might appear in the way that we source and react to applications and assess applications? So whoever's responsible for that piece of the pie, what's your reflection on that? How are we doing that? And if we don't do it today, what are the next steps to get us more information so that we feel like we understand where we are and where there may be some gaps or opportunities? During enrollment and admission, right? Like, how are we thinking about making it as easy as possible for students to get signed up and ready for school, including thinking about the different personas of students, right? So how might, for example, a white student with a stay-at-home mom living in an upper middle class neighborhood experience the enrollment process different than a Hispanic student with a single working mom from a lower socioeconomic situation? Right? Mm-hmm. Is there something in that process that might leave the latter student more disadvantaged versus the former? Maybe not. We're not sure yet, right? But has anyone asked? Has anyone considered this? And the owner of that piece of the process should really be sitting and thinking about this and thinking about the next steps around how to assess, what the impact of their processes might be. Mm-hmm. If we keep going, right, take it into the classroom. Classroom is going to be an interesting place when we talk about DEI because there's so much happening there all at once. And this is also where publishers get more involved, right, and the organizations who are creating the content and the learning experiences. But how are we working to make sure that we have an inclusive and equitable experience for those who are underprivileged and underserved in the classroom specifically? What conversations are we having there that are teaching students about things like empathy? And to your point earlier, Tracy, learning about different backgrounds and experiences like theirs. So how is your son, being set up to have conversations like that in the classroom with their educators and their administrators? How are we supporting students from underprivileged families to engage in extracurriculars in particular, especially if their families are having a much different experience than those from more privileged families. For publishers, I think the role of the student life cycle might be a little bit less broad, like their role in that student life cycle, but much deeper, right? Because again, you're talking about the content and requirements and the learning design and the content creation and the content development and production and release and support of all of these things that are setting the tone for education. So Tracy, I think that's where some of your best practices that you were mentioning really.
Yeah, absolutely. I've seen a real trend in recent years. I've been in publishing for 20 years now, and over the last 10, and particularly the last 5, I've seen a very sharp increase in publishers really pushing DEI initiatives, really investing the time and the money to look at certainly their current content that they're developing. Nothing can get published and developed without some form of DEI content check. And that's, often just tweaking the guidelines, like, hey, when you're, there are certain phrases we no longer use. We don't want to use the term whitewash. We don't want to use the term blacklisted, for instance. And sort of, I've seen in guidelines, really, the way you talk about certain groups, we're trying to do more sensitivity around that. For instance, there's a real push in content to do a people first approach, right? Where you wouldn't say disabled people, for instance, or you wouldn't say schizophrenics. You would say something like people living with schizophrenia, because these aren't broad categories. These are people who happen to have the condition. So there's a real push to be more sensitive in the phrasing of content, not just including, there are services that certainly we've been asked at Hurix to provide for publishers, and that they're investing in because they think it's so important, is that sort of a sensitivity, a content audit around bias, sensitivity, and inclusion. So really taking the time to do their current content that's in development, but also certain important legacy content that they, books that may be in between editions, or books, particularly in K-12, that don't get new editions but are sort of classics. Like, can we do some kind of audit and see, how does this measure up against current standards of inclusivity? Are there certain phrases that could be tweaked to make them a little bit more sensitive to our current standards of how we talk about different groups of people or different situations. So, we have in some cases sent content, legacy content through, often we hire cultural consultants who can do this work specifically, who have a lot of training, who have a lot of experience in it. If we don't have people, our subject matter experts don't have experience in that particularly, we can look through that. We sometimes send it through just a sensitivity reading, which is just sort of a baseline, like, okay, is there anything that's problematic? So I think that's often the first step, is getting that data, right? Rather than tweaking every single piece of content that you have as a publisher, let's send a small section of this through an audit, just to see, what kind of changes would we be looking at? And then from there, you can make decisions about, what do we do about that? Do we overhaul everything? Do we wait until the next edition? I think that's one thing you have to do, is get that data so that you can make important decisions about where to spend the money, where to spend the time. Because, we all want to make impacts in DEI, but the truth is it costs money and it takes time. And so, you have to make decisions based on what's realistic, of this mountain of DEI work that we should realistically do. What can we do?
Right.
What can we do this year?
Talking about what can we do, probably we should go to the calls to action in the next slide, so we can see, for the viewers who are watching right now, you can probably understand, what are the calls to action for K-12 administrators or educators over here from this discussion.
Right. And I think we paused on a couple of these, right? But some of these might explain a little bit more behind the way to approach it, right? Because I think we talked a little bit about some of the hows, of the actions that we can take, but let's talk a little bit more about the approaches that will underpin that how. So like I said, assessing where you own and prioritize and can prioritize DEI in your role. Like that's step one. If you start being a bit like reflective around what your role in that end-to-end life cycle is, and start asking those questions of both yourself and your colleagues and all of those around you around what we're doing in that broader view. Tracy, I think you touched on this one earlier, and it's a really important one, which is to keep up on current and future trends in education, especially in K-12 right now, in the US in particular. There's a lot of conversation around how we're teaching really basic things like history and how we're even approaching content and conversations about content that's existed for a very long time, and we're rethinking the way that we want to teach that content. So there's a lot of conversation in that space, and as an administrator, as an educator, or as a publisher, I think we all have a responsibility to be up to date on that and to really understand how that impacts what we do, and also how we might have a voice in those conversations.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good thing to do for all of us, and that's something that you can take responsibility around.
Right.
You know, you don't have to convince anyone to keep up with trends yourself. You know, that's something you can do immediately, and keep your eyes open, make sure that you understand yourself, like what piece of that you own, like you said.
Right. And how it might actually disrupt or enable your work around something like equity. So I had a lot of those conversations in the ed tech space to say, okay, we want to prioritize equity. How can we do that if we're being asked to censor, this content, or we're being asked to rewrite that content? And how does that kind of slam up against our inclusivity guidelines or the audits that we're doing, or how we're prioritizing accessibility in our software and platforms, et cetera? The next bullet, though, I want to pause on and take a moment because it's an important one, which is to engage, design, work, and execute with curiosity, empathy, and respect, right? So we were just talking about a couple examples where something like using specific kinds of vocabulary can make some people feel more included, but we have to also realize that no group is a monolith, and no group feels the exact same way about anything, including things like vocabulary and words that we use and the way that we talk about identities. So there's always going to be conflicting best practices and advice that you get, and that can be so frustrating. It can be so hard and challenging.
Yeah, I have examples of that. A lot of the publishers that I work with are now trying to think more carefully about gender, and for instance, trying to eliminate unnecessary gender references. For instance, if you had a test bank of questions and you were presenting those, you don't have to include a gender in a character name necessarily. That might not impact the question at all, so why include it? And if you do have to include it, how do you speak around the he or she? So some publishers have been allowing the use of a singular person referred to as they. And when I'm explaining this to some of the authors that we've worked with, some of them have kind of raised concerns about this, like, because maybe it's not grammatically correct according to the grammar that they've been using all through school, and it's not even grammatically correct. Why would I change it to they? And so you're absolutely right. It's like that you can't get everyone on board, and so you have to have those difficult conversations about, well, it's not necessarily the way you would like to write it, but this is a publisher is paying for this, and more importantly, this is what they want to do for their end users. So
right. And I think that's an example of trying to explain the why behind what we're doing, even more so than the what, is so important, because when people understand, when they hear that personal story from somebody like me, right? Because the gender vocabulary one is one that I deal with a lot in my life as somebody who is gender nonconforming and identifies as transgender. I can share a personal story about how that impacts me, right? And so when we are able to explain that why and really kind of personalize it, sometimes it will allow people to get a little bit more comfortable with the uncomfortable. And that's essentially what we're asking them to do throughout this process sometimes. And then we'll finish up because I know we want some time for Q&A, but championing the importance of DEI to student success. I think this one is particularly important for like an administrator, right? What a way to have an impact to be able to just very clearly answer the what, why, how and who around DEI to anyone throughout that end-to-end life cycle, so that you are constantly championing the work and really inviting others to also come along and be an ally and stay curious and continue learning about all of these different concepts and the way that they can be integrated into the day-to-day. And finally, being patient with yourself and those around you. As we just described, this is complex stuff, folks, and
It's complex, and it
it's
doesn't
scary
happen overnight.
sometimes.
Yeah. So, I think that's an important point. Just, get started somehow, but understand it can't happen overnight. You can't get every person on board overnight, but you can start making steps toward that.
So, Kristy, on that fourth point, we actually have a question from our attendee. They're saying, how do I motivate my administration or my management team to adopt DEI initiatives? So that's more on the fourth point where you said that it has to be a collective effort within an organization. What if it's not a collective effort and you actually have to motivate people? So how should a person go about that?
Yeah, it's a really important question, and one that, as you can imagine, doing this work across global organizations, I'm constantly asking myself and constantly trying to find best practices around. But my general advice is to think about yourself wearing a tool belt and start putting gathering tools that you can put in that tool belt that will work for anyone who you encounter. And I say that because if we're going to respect diversity, we have to respect the fact that everybody responds to different things. Some administrators or people who you're talking to are going to respond much more to facts, right? So for them, you might want to pull out that tool of, I have all this research and data showing doing X, Y, and Z, or how DEI generally impacts student success in these ways, or can make us more successful as an organization, or can drive our business outcomes, et cetera, right? You have that tool that you pull out for that person. Another person might be more moved and motivated by personal stories. And that's the kind of person that you want to make sure that you have a tool to say, look, here are some really clear examples, again, that why we're talking about these things. Somebody might react with initial frustration of, oh, why do we have to think about, this complexity of this word? It seems so silly to spend all this time and energy on it.
Right.
Great time to say, here's why. Here's a personal anecdote from somebody and how it impacts them. And either bringing in speakers, asking people to share their stories who or hiring some experts and others to kind of tell those stories is a really great way. And then another kind of personality type might be somebody who really responds more to the strategy and operations type approach, like we were talking about earlier. And that's where you can sit down and say, look, we think about how we prioritize all kinds of business how we think about business priorities throughout this end-to-end cycle. It's really important to think about how we do this as well, because that enables everything else, right? Don't forget, we're talking about just people here and how we enable people. And that's the basis of anything that we do. And I think we often forget when we're talking about all the things involved in our work that it's always, in the end, it's always about people. They're either doing the work or they're the ones who are, our customers, or they're the learners. People are the focus of everything that we do. So how are we actually thinking through this, our strategy and our operations from that people perspective? And that's going to organically and naturally bring up a lot of these DEI concepts that we're thinking about.
Absolutely.
Tracy, I don't know if you would add anything else there.
Yeah. I'd like to know your thoughts, Tracy, on this one.
No, I think you covered it well. It's, it's trying to approach it in different ways, I think, is useful, because it is hard to sometimes, I think individuals can be motivated to take on some of these initiatives, but it may feel like climbing a mountain to get your administration on board. Because again, some of these initiatives, all they may see is, well, what is this going to cost? How are we going to do this? It seems like a big undertaking, and it doesn't always have to be, because I think you can start somewhere to make a big impact, I think. Before entire policies are adopted across the school, what can you do in your classroom individually? What can I do in the way that I'm talking to students or my coworkers, or, so you can make small moves that make a big impact, I think.
Right. And those small impacts can add up and convince others who are still a little reluctant, right? Like when they start seeing the
But like you said, know your audience, I guess, is, do you need facts to motivate? Do you need stories? Do you need, I think that's helpful advice, the tool belt analogy.
Great thoughts, great thoughts. Just going forward with the Q&A, we don't have much time for it. Maybe I'll extend the session to 5 or 10 minutes more because we have got one more question here. I'll put it out to both of you. How can technology help publishers or school administrators adopt DEI much faster than what they do right?
Tracy, do you want to take this one first? And
Yeah. I know that during, I mentioned before, content audits of stuff. I think that sometimes you can use technology, you can use tools to actually scan bits of content to pick up key phrases. And I think that in that way, you can fairly quickly come to some conclusions about what degree of our content would have to be reworked. And with actual numbers, you can get some data quickly about, in a textbook, how many references are there that may be slightly problematic. And I think sometimes when you see those numbers, you're like, okay, this is actually a bigger deal than we thought it would be, And so I think that can get some, when you have to convince groups of people, if they see hard data, sometimes they're like, oh, okay, I see that there are, references over 6 of our chapters. That's kind of a bigger deal than we thought it was going to be. And so that suddenly comes to the higher front. Or you can get information, again, data can be used to track like who is enrolling in certain programs, and to get data on what the diverse makeup of that is can really have an impact in how you're, how you're approaching it. So I think sometimes that data can help speed decisions along better, than rather just one person saying, hey, this is really important. Let's spend some money. Let's spend some time thinking about this. I think if you get that data, that can be really helpful and really powerful in arguing why these initiatives need to happen.
And I think a lot of technologies have unlocked potential for us to think more broadly about how to create equity. And something like that could be, what are the study tools or other kinds of resources and things that we're offering along with our content and our products that can help level that playing field for the student who has an after-school job versus the student who doesn't, right? How are we helping that student who has more distractions in their life to have a similar opportunity for success? And a lot of the platforms and the software that we're creating have unlocked a lot of potential. Accessibility is another, right? Like
huge one,
so many folks with different disabilities when we were just using hard copy books, right, really struggled with the way that they can engage. And now with different technologies, we can think about how to enable them a bit more directly. There are always risks with it though, right? Like we see how technology, I actually just gave a talk about this recently, technology can either enhance or mitigate equity. So we always need to take that step back and think about the 2 possible effects of anything that we're doing, right? This accessibility feature that we're rolling out, how might it enable folks with blindness, but it's actually disabling, folks with like cognitive disabilities, for example. Just constantly being reflective about all the different possible outcomes is important as well, because we can't see any given thing as, a very simple and clear answer, because that's just not how people work, right? We're a more complex species than that.
So just on the topic of technology, we do have another question from an anonymous attendee. Never mentioned the name, but do you think introducing webinars and workshops first in that organization or maybe an educational institution would help to start talking about diversity and equity and inclusion?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's going to be a varied approach that you want to consider. When I've built learning programs for organizations, including ed tech companies, I really tried to think about what that variety of touch points would be with these concepts. And I talked about it as having like 3 or 4 legs to the stool, right? We have more traditional training and webinars for folks who really like to learn that way. We bring in speakers to complement the concepts that we're introducing as part of those webinars, so that people who are driven more by those stories have access to that. And we have events around those speakers, right? We have conversation series where we talk about current events, for example, that are coming up, and we're tying in all of these concepts across. So I think a really great way, I mean, we're educators here, right? So let's start with what the learning objectives are that we want to bring into the organization, and then think about the way to pepper those learning objectives or those learning outcomes across all of the different touch points that we have. How are we talking about DEI in our general business communications, right? How are we amplifying some of the good work that teams are doing around it to get others to get more excited about getting engaged? How are we complementing all of that with training and webinars? So I think it's certainly a start, but don't forget that some people are actually going to respond negatively to that sort of direct intervention. And there's actually some research that shows DEI training can backfire depending on how we do it and shut people more down to the concepts. So I can't talk too much about the importance of integrating and variety and flexibility in the way that we approach this work. So that way we're constantly inviting people in and we're constantly kind of soft pushing out at the same time, but in a variety of different ways. And sometimes people don't even know what's happening, which is I call sneaky DEI.
I think that's actually really important, that sneaky DEI, because I myself have been invited to trainings about sensitivity, or, you know, every time HR calls you into a meeting or something, you're like, oh gosh, what do we have to talk about now? So I think you're right that integrating it in different ways can be really effective, because no one wants to have a corporate training every time they need to think about something new. But it can be different. It can be a speaker that's engaging. It can be different approaches. And I think that's important just for all of us. You know, no one wants to sit through a million HR presentations about why it's important to think about certain things.
Right. And I think find the secret sauce for your organization, right? If your organization is very much customer driven, then bring in some customers, bring in some students, have them tell their stories, right? If your organization is more like revenue driven, then bring in some folks who've done this research, or some organizations who help businesses think through, you know, why this work really can help their bottom line. I'm so confident in the positive impact of this work that I think that there's a great way to bring people along, just about anybody along. It's just a matter of finding what that way is, and then, you know, kind of flexing across.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Fantastic. And I hope this webinar is also a good start for those watching who can, you know, who wish to adopt DEI in their organizations, along with, you know, the tips that you both have given today. I think that's a great start for them as well. I think we're a little beyond our time today, but that was a great, insightful conversation. Fantastic tips. Thanks a lot to both of you. That's about all the time we have today for you on the webinar. Again, I'd like to thank the panelists for their time and the insights, strategies that they've discussed today for introducing DEI in schools, in K-12 schools, and educational institutions, as well as organizations. Thank you so much. At Hurix Digital, we help organizations from across the industries to achieve their business goals, just like DEI, with a future-ready learning content solutions, cloud platforms, content transformation, and technology services. So if you wish to explore our DEI services for K-12 content to the listeners here, let's talk. You can explore more about us by, you know, going to our website, which is hurix.com, or you can set up a quick exploratory call with us on the link provided here on the screen, and we can put that one on the chat as well. So fantastic discussion. Thanks a lot to all the panelists again, and I hope the listeners were able to gain some very valuable insights into diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging in K-12 educational content. Thanks a lot, everyone, for tuning in. Goodbye and good night.
Thanks so much. Thanks for your time, everyone.